Welcome to our virtual flight around Wrangell St. Elias National Park. The photos and information offered here will give you a very good glimpse into the splendor of America's largest and we think most spectacular national park. Just please remember that even the best photo is a sorry substitute for the real thing. Those of you who have flown with us know this. You've been there. Those of you who hope to fly with us someday, or are just interested in flying, geology, the fascinating history of this area, or Alaska in general, keep in mind the old expression, words are the finger pointing at the moon. Nowhere is this truer than in the overwhelming majesty of the bottomless valleys, massive glaciers, and towering peaks of the Wrangell St. Elias. On the other hand, here is an opportunity to soak up some of the information we discussed during our flights, while not being distracted by all that pesky scenery surrounding the airplane. As a pilot, I continually remind folks to soak up the splendor outside the window rather than spending their entire flight peering through a camera lens or analyzing plate tectonics. But as you'll see, I'm fascinated by all the factual stuff I'm all too capable of boring my passengers with, so here you have it. Now, if this show is a keepsake of a flight you already made, then thanks very much for flying with us. We hope this will help you hold on to great memories and perhaps further clarify what may have been an almost overwhelming amount of sensory input. There is a lot to see and think about out there. Without an airplane, you can barely scratch the surface of the 13 million acres of Wrangell St. Elias Park. That's where we come in. Wrangell Mountain Air offers many options when it comes to getting beyond the end of the road. This show will offer a condensation of highlights of our 3 most popular scenic flights, each one of which makes a successively larger foray into the depths of the park. Or, if we flew you in for a backcountry trip, here's another aerial view of the wilderness you explored on the ground. And finally, if you flew into McCarthy with us from Chitina or elsewhere, you'll once again see the great views you experienced of the Kennecott Glacier Valley. We've also thrown in a few close-ups of other scenery and historical sites you may have seen en route. Enough said. It may be fantasy, but enjoy the flight. We'll begin our flight from the McCarthy airstrip, but we won't even attempt to explain the appealing oddity that is the town of McCarthy. That does have to be experienced on the ground. Even from our airstrip, the view of the 25-mile Kennecott Amphitheater is outrageous, but you ain't seen nothing yet. As we lift off, we'll turn out over the immense terminus of the glacier, and from an aerial perspective, it becomes much more obvious that there really is ice under all that rocky debris. Giant melting sinkholes give us a glimpse into the hundreds of feet of ice which underlie a thin covering of just a few feet of the eroded material carried down by these glaciers. Under our right wing, looking up glacier, we see the old mining town of Kennecott. A lot of folks assume that these rock piles resulted from mining activity, until they get up here in the plain and can trace the long, slow course they take down the continuous length of the glaciers. We'll continue our climb out over the glacier in order to reduce the noise we make in town, and tease you at the same time with a tantalizing pan of the Root Glacier and its origins at the Stairway Icefall, past Donahoe Peak, and on up to the Kennecott source, 16,390-foot Mount Blackburn. Then we're going to tear you away and leave the spectacular vista behind. But not to worry, we'll be back, re-entering this valley way up in the scenery we're merely gaping at from here. For now, our route takes us southeast, back over the airstrip in order to follow a succession of river drainages which will give us access to the vast roadless reaches of the park. The Kennecott River, coming right out of the toe of the glacier below us, is soon joined by McCarthy Creek on the left. The town of McCarthy itself sits on the point of land formed by these two rivers, but we'll leave civilization behind and head up McCarthy Creek toward the broad Nazina River Valley. Crossing Sourdough Ridge into the Nazina, we'll take a final look back at the great fin-like Porphyry Ridge, which divides the 2 parallel valleys of the Kennecott Glacier and McCarthy Creek as it winds up toward 13,800-foot Wrangell Mountain. This ridge is where the copper lies, at least the purest, most concentrated deposits. Further up the ridge is Bonanza Peak, home to the various highly productive shafts of the Kennecott Company. More on these as we return home. I was a little premature, perhaps, about leaving civilization. Below us in the Nizina Valley, we still see lots of signs of human activity. This valley and its tributaries were also quite active during the mining days, and as a result, a significant amount of private land or inholdings remain within the park boundaries. A few hardy folks still make their year-round homes out here, and those on this side of the Nizina can get back to town via what used to be a well-traveled road. In fact, we'll do a little circle here to get a view of what remains of the old Nizina Bridge. Several of the old uprights remain from what was obviously a major engineering feat, crossing about a half-mile of the sprawling glacial river. And the Nizina is relatively narrow right here. Just a bit upstream, it's almost a mile and a half wide. At least so it appears. But in fact, the active river itself only occupies a small portion of the overall riverbed. These Alaskan rivers carry so much silt, sand, and larger material from their mountain-grinding glacier sources that they continually clog up whatever channel they're currently flowing in and then have to migrate to a new channel. This process is so constant that vegetation doesn't have a chance to grow in the vacated channels, and as a result, the entire riverbed is one huge gravel pit. Only the very rare glacial outburst flood would ever fill this river bank full. We'll see signs of that a little later on. You can imagine what a challenge bridge building is in this environment. The state of Alaska obviously felt that the mining areas of Dan Creek and the Chittitu Valley offered worthwhile destinations. Of course, the bridge is no longer in use, its approaches having been destroyed by the 1964 earthquake, with subsequent floods finishing the job. The state did have it right, though, since the area's placer gold output was 143,000 ounces by 1959. Continuing up the Nizina, we cross the small airstrips of May Creek and Dan Creek. But before we do, take a look at the vast gash of rock oozing off Sourdough Mountain on our left. We'll see lots of these rock glaciers during our flight, but this one is a particularly good example. Just as the name implies, they're about a 60-40 mix of rock and ice, bound together in an extremely slow, yet constantly moving mass. Kind of like the blob, you can see it consuming the forest below it at a rate of about a foot a year. Far slower than an ice glacier. Although not unique to the Wrangels, rock glaciers are much more common here than anywhere else on Earth. Jumping from the large to the small, notice these tiny white dots on the ponds below us. Wildlife can be pretty tough to spot from the air, but we frequently see tundra swans here, standing out against the dark water. Generally, they're in pairs, since they mate for life and tend to return to the same pond every year. Hopefully, later in the summer, a brood of cygnets will trail out behind them. A huge fork in the road appears before us at this point. The confluence of the Chittistone and Nizina rivers offers us a fascinating choice of route. About 100 years ago, the choice was a lot more serious than fascinating. We've been flying along what was known as the All-American Route to the Klondike, which began in Valdez, crossed Thompson Pass or the Valdez Glacier, and followed the Chitna and Nizina rivers. It's easy to imagine how exhausted the stampeders would have been by this point, and why a shorter but icier route would have been appealing. We'll take a little detour for a distant look at the icy route in a moment, then return here to follow the Chittistone Valley over what's known as the Goat Trail towards Chittistone Pass and the White River, a tributary to the Yukon. By no means easy, the Goat Trail was a much safer route. Incidentally, this is where two of our Flight C routes diverge as well. If we were on our shorter flight, we would stick with the Nizina River and not make the big loop around Chittistone Pass. The two routes do rejoin way up the Nizina Glacier. We'll be there in about 20 minutes. Whichever route we're taking, we can't miss what's off our left wing right now. Actually, it's off, under, and towering over our left wing, the mile-high cliffs. Laced with waterfalls, this limestone wall is a giant slice through the geology of the Wrangels. The strata or layering of the limestone is very apparent, so it's easy to visualize millennia of sea animals contributing their calcium-rich shells to its undersea formation. It's a long look back, of course, over 200 million years. Approaching the upstream end of the 5-mile-long cliff, the forces which transported these layers from ancient equatorial seas are quite striking. Huge folds in the layers, some over 180 degrees, are perfect demonstrations of the tremendous forces at play as two of the Earth's massive tectonic plates collided right here along the Wrangell and St. Elias ranges. And don't look now, but right behind us comes another mess of rock, known to geologists as a terrain, slamming into North America, the Chugach Range. Not to worry. We should be able to outrun it, since we're doing about 150 miles per hour, and the Pacific Plate is doing about 5 inches per year. The geology of the Wrangells is a fascinating mishmash, given the ongoing accumulation of generally ocean-formed landmasses which have joined North America along the Alaskan coast. Later, as we climb higher into the mountains, we'll be going forward through time. But down here at the canyon bottom, we're looking at two early layers of Wrangellia, the terrain which predominates from here all the way up through the Talkeetna Mountains, themselves crashing into the Alaska Range close to Denali. The easiest way to visualize this whole process is to imagine separate chunks of ancient land formations, the terrains, being carried along on a ridiculously large, slow conveyor belt. The belt is the Pacific Tectonic Plate, which slides under North America along a series of west coast faults, and in so doing scrapes its cargo off on the edge of our continent. The plot, not to mention the continent, thickens, however, since the leading edge of the Pacific Plate melts as it is forced under the lighter rock of the continental plate, subsequently bubbling upward as volcanoes, thus forming the younger, highest peaks of the Wrangells. We'll see those soon enough as well. Just before we leave this rather heavy subject, however, notice the distinct line between two layers at the bottom of the mile-high cliffs. The dark rock below is the basement layer of Nikolai Greenstone, a very old submarine lava flow, which is capped by the Chittestone limestone, which forms most of the cliff. The seam between those rocks will show up off and on throughout our flight, but it will be most visible near the mining areas of Kennecott. For good reason. That contact zone is where the copper forms. Back to that later, too. Okay, let's get a little more modern here and check out something much faster. Glaciers. Yeah, well, not that fast, I guess, but it is all relative. We can now see up the Nizina River to its source, the Nizina Glacier. And a spectacular source it is. Many of those dirty chunks of ice we're looking at are football fields in size, and they are floating. So, to quote the cliche, that's just the tip of the iceberg, and that is a big lake. You can also see the old arc of debris which the glacier plowed up at the lake's end, a terminal moraine. At one point during the glacier's recent retreat, that dam of dirt and rock completely sealed the river channel, forming an even larger lake. The rapid escape of water through the breach at the far side would have caused quite a glacial outburst flood downstream. Remember the condition of the Nizina Bridge? And what is with all this dirt? There are lots of ways to think of glaciers. Certainly they are rivers of ice. But they're bulldozers and conveyor belts too, slowly grinding and carrying away the mountains they run through. The very fine powder, called glacial till or flour, remains suspended in the resulting rivers as they flow along. Each river's color is determined by the geology of its valley and creates a mixing, paint-like interface when two rivers merge. There's much more red iron in the rock upstream on the Nizina when compared with the grayer water of the West Fork. All right, we'll do a 180 here and give the right side of the plain a close-up view of the mile-high cliffs as we rejoin the Chittestone River. We do like to keep it fair. It's amazing how those waterfalls carve huge bowls into the rock as they fall. Limestone is a very soluble rock. Even mist slowly dissolves it. Chitna, Chittatu, Chittestone. That prefix comes up a lot, for good reason. In Atna, the local native language, it's the prefix for copper. Aha, Atna. Nikolai Pass, just to our right, is named for Chief Nikolai of the Otna, a very large presence when the first white people arrived here. Although the Otna didn't have permanent settlements this far up the Chitna Valley, they did have seasonal hunting camps right in this area. And the copper nuggets they were known for, and which were a hot trading commodity with the tribes on the coast, were from these stream beds as well. Northeastbound up the deep Chittastone Canyon, we want to keep our eyes open for white dots again, this time larger. Both Dall sheep and mountain goats are frequently spotted along these ledges. It's absolutely astounding where these animals hang out, particularly the goats. Rock climbers have photographed goats on terrain even expert humans wouldn't climb without ropes and hardware. Speaking of humans, although empty in comparison to most places on Earth, the Chittastone Valley is a popular hiking destination in the park. We'll pass over several backcountry airstrips in this valley, most of which were associated with old mining exploration. Hikers are frequently dropped off here either as a starting point or to take advantage of the public cabins which the Park Service maintains. I mentioned the goat trail earlier. We'll do a turn here to give everyone a view of famous but rarely seen Chittastone Falls. Tumbling 300 feet in 2 drops, they obviously block travel along the valley floor. Instead, hikers are forced way up onto a series of very exposed ledges as they pick their way up towards Chittastone Pass, a route more suitable for goats. And here's the pass itself. It's basically all downhill from here. If you're a snowflake falling in this area, you have a choice. Fall behind us into the Copper River Basin and out to the Pacific, or just ahead onto the Russell Glacier and the White River drainage and make your way to the Bering Sea via the White River and the Yukon. This is the watershed. The same was true for the miners, whether they were on their way to the Klondike or the Shoshana Gold Rush. The Shoshana Valley, about 50 miles from here, was the scene of the last great rush in Alaska in 1913. Though it didn't pan out, so to speak, in a big way financially, it was very successful in luring away much of the Kennecott Company's workforce. We've climbed our way up to well over 7,000 feet by now, and we're getting up into the true high country. Below us, Skolai Lake is frozen until well into the summer, and obviously its source, the Russell Glacier, is frozen all the time. Stretching almost 30 miles, the Russell drains the northernmost tall summits of the St. Elias Mountains, Mount Churchill at 15,600 feet, and Mount Bona at 16,400 feet. Confined to a valley for most of its run, the Russell is able to spread itself out into the flats below us, and as a result splays open into amazingly patterned blue crevasses. After some gentle turns up here, so both sides of the plain share all the views of these spectacular peaks, we'll begin to make our way down Skolai Creek back toward the Nizina Valley. If the air is smooth, we'll make a little side trip. Not all glaciers are confined to valley floors, and a little detour around Mount Baldwin gives us great close-up views of a bunch of hanging glaciers, the Seven Sisters. Hanging glaciers are wildly steep and moved more by gravity than by the weight of ice behind them, as is the case with valley glaciers. Occasionally, huge chunks or towers of ice known as seracs give spectacular displays as they break off the bottom edge of hanging glaciers, free-falling thousands of feet. We may not see this in action, but the icy debris is quite visible below us. Emerging from the hole-in-the-wall glacier and back into the Skolai Valley, we're faced with an onslaught of color. On the far side of the valley is the Golden Horn, a limestone outcropping, garishly colored by volcanic impurities rich in hematite, one of the most common iron ores. This mineral-rich area attracted both miners and geologists. As a result, much is known about it. Imagine a shallow sea, almost 300 million years ago, with strong tidal currents and lava either falling in from shore or oozing out underwater. The calcium-rich shells are still visible as fossils today, if you care to get low enough to see them. Supposedly, many are nearly in the positions in which they grew, complete with the fronds of plants which fell over them on the ocean bottom. Or you could save a lot of hiking and just go to Hawaii to find a modern equivalent. More of the same formation appears on the left side of the airplane too. The creek, and an earlier glacier sawed it right in half. Scollay Creek empties out into the Nizina Glacier right where it's formed by the confluence of two other great glaciers, the Wrangell and the Rhone. In fact, straight ahead of us, at the head of the Wrangell Glacier, is Wrangell Mountain, the back side that is. The other side is the Stairway Icefall, towering over McCarthy. Let's head that way, what do you say? I can't believe I'm not lost anymore. Crossing the Nizina and heading up the Wrangell, we pass over the alternative route to the Yukon we mentioned some time ago. You can just imagine a series of under-equipped, inexperienced gold seekers trying to find their way up over this icy landscape. The fact that there was even a roadhouse a little further up the Rhone Glacier at a place called Whiskey Hill probably didn't help matters. Since a number of them never arrived at their destination, one has to assume that some of the miners are still down in those crevasses. I wonder what kind of civilization will find them when their well-preserved bodies float out into Nizina Lake hundreds of years from now. We'll be crossing some high terrain between here and the Stairway Icefall. That puts us up in the youngest and highest geological layer in the Wrangels. A great example of this more durable volcanic basalt is Chimney Mountain, which towers above the confluence of the Wrangell and Rhone glaciers. The spire of Chimney Mountain is part of a layer of younger lava flows which stretches almost as far as we can see in all directions at the higher elevations. Called the Wrangell Formation, it's the result of about 26 million years of volcanic activity issuing forth at different times from the great peaks which still dominate the area. Only Mount Wrangell continues to be active right now, though, and that's limited to steam, gas, and occasionally ash. But Mount Churchill behind us had significant eruptions about 1250 and again 1900 years ago, putting out a layer of ash which covered about 130,000 square miles of the Yukon Territory and is still coloring the White River white today. It takes a pretty clear day, but from our current altitude, near 10,000 feet, we frequently get a great view of the great summits of the St. Elias from here. Mount St. Elias itself is the second tallest peak in Alaska at 18,008 feet. It sits right in the corner which forms the state's panhandle and looks right down on the Pacific Ocean. To the left, across the Canadian border, stands Mount Logan, a very deceptive summit since it's so massive that it appears far shorter than it actually is. At 19,850 feet, over 6,000 meters, Logan is second only to Denali in North America. This lofty view to the west also helps us understand why the climate in the Chitna Valley is so relatively pleasant. The St. Elias and Chugach ranges form a very effective barrier to the predominant southwesterly storm track off the Pacific. While Valdez averages about 64 inches of precipitation annually, McCarthy sees less than a fifth of that. The depth of ice in the Bagley ice field between Mounts St. Elias and Logan is also an excellent indicator. The Bagley, which is the largest continuous ice cap outside of the polar regions, is 128 miles long and was recently measured at 10,000 feet thick. As we come around the southern corner of Wrangell Mountain, we find ourselves above a hanging glacier at the head of a very narrow, steep valley. Sure enough, we're getting back into our neighborhood. This is the very beginning of McCarthy Creek. Town is just a 20-mile kayak trip downstream. Sliding over the last ridge onto the Root Glacier at the base of the Stairway Icefall is an absolute jaw-dropper. True, this view is available from town, but it's a whole other world up here close and personal. Generally, the air is smooth enough for us to sidle right up next to a vertical 1.5 miles of tumbling blue ice. Dropping continuously from over 11,000 feet on Wrangell Mountain down to about 4,000 feet on the Root Glacier, the Stairway is one of the largest ice falls in the world. Now, obviously, we don't take any chances on our flights, but as we approach the icefall, it's not uncommon to hear a gasp in our headsets. Scale is so altered up here that it appears as though you could reach out and touch the blue ice while still hundreds of feet away. Surrounded by thousands of ice cubes, it's a little hard to grasp that many of them are the size of apartment buildings. Raising one wing to permit a view up on the icefall side of the plane gives us another extraordinary sight looking down. The rock-free white surface of the Root Glacier is actually sprinkled with azure blue pools of water. Like perfect prisms, they absorb all the colors of the rainbow except this perfectly pure blue. It's the same reason the sky is blue, only better. What's more, some of this water is flowing wildly, cutting very thin but deep canyons in the ice until the streams disappear into moulins, vertical tunnels which carry the water below the glacier and on down the valley. Now this is a storybook flight, but once again it's textbook too. As we cross the ridge above Donahoe Peak, we enter the Gates Glacier. From its beginning at another large ice fall, the Gates continues down its valley, carrying a pattern of concentric circles. Just like tree rings, these ogives reflect the fact that a glacier's movement surges each summer, and also that the velocity of the glacier is greater in the center, where friction from the valley walls doesn't hold it back. Now, we've been awfully busy looking down lately, but that's about to change. Many peaks in the Kennecott Basin contribute to its vast accumulation of ice. From Wrangell Mountain past Parka Peak, the Otna Peaks, and Rime Peak, the terrain pretty much hangs in there at 13,000 feet and above. But heading westward into the upper Kennecott Glacier, we fall into the shadow of the 800-pound gorilla of this neighborhood, Mount Blackburn. Once again, scale is completely skewed as we maneuver under the many hanging glaciers which feed the Kennecott from the flanks of Blackburn. It feels as though any avalanche would fall right on us, but of course we're still well clear. Although more visible on the flight into McCarthy from Chittenden, as we turn to head back down glacier, the shoulder of Castle Peak is visible behind the ridges of Blackburn. Now separated by almost 8 miles, Castle Peak was originally the other side of the same volcano, Blackburn, now a mere shadow of its far more massive former self. Some estimates place its original pre-eruption altitude as comparable to Everest. Heading down the Kennecott back toward McCarthy sort of feels like driving down a multi-laned freeway. These long lines of material, which from the air look like gravel but actually include house-sized boulders, are called medial moraines. Tracing them back upstream, we see that the stripes begin where 2 forks of a glacier merge, each carrying the side scrapings from its own valley, which join to become the center of the new, larger glacier. Each colored by its own source geology, by the time they reach the glacier's toe, the medial moraines, which actually insulate the ice below them, have fanned out to almost completely hide all ice from view. On the right side of this freeway is a very interesting side street. Depending on what time of the summer you fly with us, Hidden Lake Valley will either look like it should, a lake, or more like an empty bowl of beached icebergs. Each year, Hidden Creek slowly fills this valley, which is sealed by the Kennecott Glacier, until sometime in July, when enough water accumulates in the lake to float its icy dam and burrow its way beneath the ice. Not reappearing until it emerges at the Kennecott River, this annual flood lasts for days, increasing the river's flow more than tenfold. Donahoe Mountain splits the Root and Kennecott glaciers. We'll make one more turn back up the Root, giving us a great view of the mines and town of Kennecott below our right wing. From up here we can also clearly see why all the development is here in the first place. The contact zone between our old friends, the Nikolai Greenstone and the Chittestone Limestone, is clear as a bell. From the Bonanza Mine, 4,000 feet above town, down past the Jumbo Mine, re-emerging on Donahoe Mountain on the opposite side of the Root Glacier. Plus, there's one more mine, which is just a speck from here. But as we get closer, keep your eyes on the contact zone. Perched right on that cliff is the bunkhouse of the Erie Mine. As we fly quite close, we'll see the old mine shaft in the gully right behind it. Imagine hauling all those materials up this cliff, which they did until their cable tram from the glacier's edge was completed. Eventually, by the time they were done mining in 1938, the miners could walk to work underground all the way from the Bonanza Mine. There were over 60 miles of shaft honeycombing these hills. Here comes a big descending turn back down Glacier. It almost looks too tight to make the turn down in this canyon, but it's that matter of scale again. The ice is about a mile wide here. but that's not as big as it used to be. Looking at either edge, we can see what looks like a bathtub ring of unvegetated gray gravel and rock at the base of the valley walls. This lateral moraine shows us that the glacier has lost over 100 feet of depth so fast that plants have not had time to grow. If you've been to Kennecott, you've seen the great view across the glacier to Fireweed Mountain. But 100 years ago, that view was blocked by ice. The Kennecott has also receded nearly a half-mile at its terminus near town. Great views from both sides of the plain here as we rejoin the main glacier. On our right, we look over Donahoe Falls all the way back up the Kennecott to Mount Blackburn. And below us on the left, little tiny dots on the ice, people on a glacier hike. Those crevasses are a whole lot deeper than they look from here. Take that hike if you get a chance. It really puts you in your place. Sometimes we get a little big-headed up here in the plain. So there you have it, a grand tour of Wrangell St. Elias National Park. And we think you'll agree it's the only way to see it all. Which, of course, we didn't. In combination with two contiguous Canadian parks, this is the largest protected area in the world, about 24 million acres. We've just flown over 150 miles and barely scratched the surface. But what a great taste. Our landing pattern will take us right over the toe of the Kennecott Glacier, the footbridges and town, a beautiful beaver pond which occasionally hosts a moose, and finally McCarthy Creek one more time. Thanks very much for flying with us, and have a great stay here at the end of the road. Speaking of the road, which Wrangell Mountain Air may have helped you to avoid, here are a few close-up views of points of interest that we often point out on our flights from Chittana into McCarthy. The Gillahina Bridge, built from 500,000 board feet of timbers in only 8 days. The Tusculana Bridge and Gorge, another remnant of the Copper River and Northwestern Railway, which is essentially what we still drive today. Fish wheels, which we see very fleetingly as we land at the Chittana airstrip.
Mm-hmm.